Have you ever wondered what fishermen prayed for before they even cast their nets? Tonight we open on the damp wooden docks of a Viking fishing village at dawn. The sea air is sharp, the planks slick with frost. A gull screeches overhead like it's auditioning for a Norse opera. Nets are slung over barrels, cod flops in woven baskets, and a bleary-eyed fisherman rubs his temples with the back of a fish-scaled hand. He yawns. He curses the chill. Then he picks up a runestone. Not a big one, mind you. Nothing that would require a crane or ceremonial chanting. Just a small, palm-sized slab carved with strange marks. Runes old and curling, etched deep into the surface like stubborn wisdom. He tucks it neatly next to his slab of smoked herring, wraps it in linen, and stows it in his lunch sack. And you blink. Because this is not your average fishing prep. But welcome to the north, where boats don't sail without prayers, and even your midday meal might carry the protection of the gods, or at least a nicely worded suggestion that the sea not swallow you whole. Unless, of course, you can out-pray a cod curse. Then maybe you'll be fine. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're here, let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. I always love seeing how far these sleepy sails drift. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The fisherman adjusts his leather belt, pats the pocket where the runestone sits, and squints at the water like he suspects it's plotting something, which in Viking folklore it probably is. His boat is simple oaken ribs, broad hull, sealskin-wrapped seams, but inside, tucked beneath a coiled net and a poorly folded tunic, is a pouch containing dried fish, a wedge of hard cheese, a pewter flask of sour beer, and one carefully prepared charm carved with the rune Algae's protection. You ease into his world, sitting beside him in the boat as it rocks gently on the waves. The oars creak like old joints. The sun hasn't fully risen, but the sea's awake, dark and restless. And somewhere deep beneath the spirits stir. The Norse believed the sea had moods, sometimes generous, sometimes malicious. Not just waves and weather, but actual entities. Mare dwellers, water trolls, drowned men who'd never made it home. To sail without a blessing was to sail half-prepared. So they packed runes, little ones, slips of carved bone or stone inked with red ochre or blood, sometimes worn around the neck, other times slipped into food satchels like tiny edible prayers. Do not actually eat them. Even Vikings weren't that hardcore. One fisherman centuries later was found buried with a pouch around his neck. Inside fish bones, a tiny stone carved with tiwaz, the warrior's rune, and a piece of whale blubber wrapped in linen. Historians still debate whether this was a snack, a charm, or both. Personally, I vote multitasking. You watch the man beside you cast his net slow and practiced. Then he reaches into his sack and rubs the edge of the stone like it's a worry token. That's no accident. Runes weren't just for communication. They were active magic. The very act of carving was believed to activate the word or intention. Runes for safety, runes for luck, runes for warmth. sometimes even for finding fish. One saga mentions a man who carved runes onto driftwood and tossed it into the sea to guide herring into his nets. It worked, until his jealous neighbor stole the wood, and the herring followed him instead. Result: rune duel. Just imagine a wizard battle, but with a lot more fish guts. Runes in lunch sacks weren't random. They were part of a larger ritual, the blend of survival and superstition. You'd pack your meal, say your charms, maybe kiss a carved token if your sweetheart gave it to you. Or your grandmother? Or someone pretending to be your grandmother but actually a forest witch. It happens. One quirky tidbit. Some fishermen reportedly named their lunch stones like pets. One 12th century rune record, partially preserved on a bark strip found near a port in Bergen, mentions a man calling his charm Leifslitnir, a made-up name that roughly translates to lunch saver or snack friend. There's no follow-up, but I hope he and Leifslitnir caught a very respectful amount of cod. The runestones weren't always grand declarations. Some were scribbled with quick words, single rune sigils for luck weather or protection from sour milk. Others had inscriptions in rhyme. One fragment found in a fjord near Trondheim simply read, "Let the wave roll soft. Let the fish swim near. Let this sack stay dry and the beer not sour." Honestly, not bad for a sea prayer. The man in the boat next to you begins humming a low, tuneless thing. It might be a song or it might be a spell. Hard to tell. He adjusts the runestone again, lays it atop the sealed pot of pickled cabbage, and mutters something under his breath. Not to you, not to the gods, but to the sea. Because the truth is, no matter how tough Norse fishermen were, and they still faced waves that could flatten villages and winds that could spin ships like toys. Runes weren't superstition. They were hope packed in leather, rubbed smooth by calloused thumbs. You glance down into the water, just for a moment, and in that glimmer that ripple did something blink. No, surely not. Still you reach into your own satchel, pull out your charm, and trace the lines with your finger, just in case. The boat rocks gently under your feet, the sea lapping like a sleepy cat against its hull. You adjust your weight, leaning toward the wind, clutching the edge of the bench where salt crusts on the wood like forgotten snow. And as the fisherman beside you digs into his satchel, not for food, but for that odd little stone again, you start to get the sense that this isn't just a quirky lunch habit. This is defensive magic. Specifically the kind designed to keep your lungs where they belong, not filled with seawater. Because let's be honest, Norse fishermen didn't fear much, but they feared drowning. And that fear they carved into stone. The runes they packed into lunch sacks weren't just for flavor. They were for survival. Symbols like algies, which resembles antlers, or a figure with arms raised, were associated with protection, divine connection, and spiritual defense. Others, like ewas, linked to yew trees, and by extension death and the afterlife, were invoked to negotiate with fate itself. You glance at the carved stone on the bench, now tied with a fraying leather strap. A simple one etched with Rido, the rune of travel. Seems fitting boats are just horses that float after all. One real historical fact, rune magic wasn't just for battle or funerals. It was used daily by blacksmiths, farmers, healers, and yes, seafarers. The Galdra an Icelandic book of magic dating centuries later, shows how Norse rune usage evolved for weather for luck, even to stop bleeding. But long before that, sailors had their own informal rune traditions passed not by priests, but through boat benches and beer stories. You notice something odd now. The fisherman, let's call him Ketil, won't touch the water without first touching the stone. It's not a habit, it's a bargain. He mutters under his breath something about letting the fjord keep its hunger. You squint, unsure if it's a blessing or a warning. Either way, you press your fingers into the grooves of the stone. And suddenly it makes sense. Because the sea in Norse cosmology wasn't just a place, it was a being. Wild, unknowable. It held drowned souls, sea dragons, the corpse roads to hell, and the occasional vengeful Norn. Just your average Tuesday. Historians still debate whether Norse fishermen believed these spirits were literal or metaphoric or something in between. But runes were their interface, their language for bargaining with forces bigger than oars. Another man in a neighboring boat, older, less interested in talking, reveals a different kind of charm, not stone, but driftwood, carved faintly, then rubbed with red ochre. It's lashed to the front of the boat like a tiny mast. The shape looks like the Naudi's rune need resistance suffering. A grim choice, but also a bold one. As if to say, we know this sea will fight us. We're ready to fight back. You smile. Not because it's cheerful, but because it's so human. Fear wrapped in ritual. The scholarly community has poked around this topic for decades. Some archaeologists argue that these lunch runes were tokens of personal superstition, like lucky socks. Others suggest they were part of a broader magical practice, potentially related to Seder, a form of Norse sorcery, often practiced by women, but occasionally by bold or slightly mad men. Some believe the runestones were blessed by Volur wandering seeresses who carved charms, tied knots, whispered spells into the cracks of the world. If one of them blessed your lunchstone, you were invincible, or at least you could eat pickled herring with confidence. And don't laugh, confidence is half the battle when your main predator is the ocean. A quirky tidbit, some rune charms were worn under the tongue. Yes, under. Carved from thin bone, etched with runes for bravery or clarity, they were slipped into the mouth like lozenges before rowing out. Some sagas even mention warriors doing this before duels. Did it work? Maybe. Did it taste like chicken? Almost certainly not. The waves rise a bit now, and you clutch the boat's edge. Ketil mutters again. He lifts the stone, kisses it, yes, really, and tucks it back into the folds of his lunch sack. Not with reverence exactly, but like someone tucking away a loaded slingshot. You peek over your own shoulder. The sky has gone pale gray. The wind picks up. You start to understand why a boat full of warriors would still pack a stone and a prayer before casting off. There's a carved plank near your seat, looks like it's been etched by multiple hands. Some crude, some artful. In the center, the rune Ansus, often associated with Odin knowledge and speech. Below it, Perthro mystery, fate, the unknown. Combined, they form a rough spell. Speak to the sea. Let it listen. not command. Listen. You lean back now, watching the shoreline shrink behind you. The mountains hunch like sleeping trolls. You realize that lunch sacks weren't just for food. They were shrines, tiny altars, crumbs and cod pressed against fate, wrapped in cloth and hope. No wonder they packed runestones. Wouldn't you? The sun finally slips free from the low-hanging mist, casting a pale gold sheen across the water. Your boat drifts with a soft creak, and Catil, the runestone-kissing fisherman, pulls a small linen bundle from his sack. He unfolds it with care. Inside a lump of smoked eel, 2 barley biscuits, a twist of goat cheese, and the runestone nestled beside them, like a beloved boiled egg. You eye it curiously. It's not fancy, roughly thumb-sized. The surface is scratched with runes that curl like ship-rigging lagus for water, gabo for exchange, and something that might be Jera harvest and cycles. This is no ordinary snack break, this is lunch magic. Because Norse fishermen didn't just eat lunch, they ritualized it. Back on shore, preparing a meal for sea travel was treated almost like a liturgy. You'd bless the fish, wrap it in seaweed, which was seen as both a preservative and a lucky material, and tuck a charm between the folds of dried bread or smoked meat. Think of it as a sacred sandwich wrap with a side of spiritual insurance. You pull your own packet from your belt pouch. A crust of flat bread, still warm, dotted with herbs. And tucked between the layers, yes, there it is, a thin bone sliver, etched with a looping rune you don't recognize. It smells faintly of ash and thyme. A real historical fact, lunch rituals were often embedded with magical practice. Several rune sticks and inscribed bones discovered in Bergen, Norway, were found in latrines, suggesting they'd been disposed of discreetly after serving their purpose, perhaps once the eater returned safely. Some even carried phrases like, "Eat well, return dry," or "Feed the hunger, not the sea." You chew slowly. The winds picked up again. Catil offers you a bit of his eel. It's chewy salty and incredibly assertive. But the real kicker is the sauce. He pulls out a small clay jar of fermented garlic and trout oil, which he spoons with a tiny antler pick carved with spirals. "What's that for, you ask?" He shrugs, keeps the wind from noticing my thoughts. "Oh, sure, because in Norse superstition, intentions mattered. If the sea spirits overheard your fears, we might capsize. The fish might vanish, this eel might taste like feet, they might act on them. So silence was safety. Or better yet, coded wishes whispered into your lunch as you packed it. You unwrap a small bundle tied with twine. Inside a triangle of linen with a dried sprig of sea lavender, a smear of honey, and a line of runes in faded charcoal. One of them reads, "I was, again, death, sure, but also transformation." Maybe it's a rune for digestion, maybe for protection, maybe both. A quirky tidbit, it was common to bury or burn food scraps at sea if the meal included a charm. The leftover bread, gone. The bones overboard. The rune stone kept. The idea was not to offend the spirits with half-used prayers or careless magic disposal. The sea was already unpredictable. You didn't need to give it more reasons. And this is where it gets even stranger. Some lunch charms weren't meant for you. They were meant for the fish. There are folk records, half-forgotten stories told in cold halls that mention fishermen feeding their charms to the sea itself, tossing a piece of rune-marked food into the water as an offering. Sometimes just bread with a drop of blood. Sometimes a carved fish made of ash wood wrapped in linen and soaked in ale. The idea: you feed the spirits first. They'll let you feed yourself next. You look at Kettle. He's finished eating, and now he presses his runestone against the rim of the boat's side. He murmurs something almost rhythmically, a kind of chant. Then he dips the stone in water just briefly and tucks it back in his sack. You ask, does it always work? He chuckles. Not always. Sometimes it just keeps the beer cold. Historians still debate whether these lunch rituals were personal magic community belief or something between. Some scholars suggest these charms were leftovers from older animist traditions where everything food boat net, even lunch, had spirit and will. Others argue they were a more practical psychological comfort. If the rune is with you, you're not alone. Both maybe. Both feel right. You bite into your last crust of bread. It's dry. Really dry. But the wind smells sweet, almost like juniper and salt. The kind of wind you trust. Katil hums again. His oars rest beside him, but he's not rowing yet. The net lies coiled. This too is part of the ritual. You don't cast the net until the lunch is eaten, until the charm is kissed, until the moment is settled. So you wait. You wipe your hands on your tunic, nod once to your own rune charm, and tuck it back in the sack. A faint warmth hums in your chest. Not heat exactly, just the feeling of being held by something older than worry. Lunch is done. The runes are full. Now it's time to fish. The net hits the water with a soft splash, sinking beneath the ripples like a sleeping serpent. You watch the rings spread across the surface, and just for a moment, everything is still like the sea is listening. Ketil leans forward, muttering a string of words in Old Norse, his fingers brushing the rim of the boat like he's tracing a boundary between worlds. This is not just fishing. This is spiritual negotiation. Because for Norse fishermen, the sea wasn't simply a place to gather food. It was a living entity full of rules, tempers, and occasionally grudges. And while runes in a lunch sack might seem like charming over-preparedness out here on the water, they're more like your only lifeline if things get complicated. Take, for instance, the tale of the biting cod. It was said, usually whispered by the older men with missing fingers and no patience, that certain fish were marked. They bore odd scars, silvered eyes, or a scale pattern that looked suspiciously like a rune. These weren't just fish. They were sea spirits in disguise, sent to test your intent. Catch one of these without a proper charm in your boat. You might find your net torn to ribbons, your oars mysteriously unmoored, or worse, your entire catch cursed to rot before sunset. One real historical fact: some Viking-era boat burials have been found with charms tucked under the oars or bound to net weights, small rune-inscribed stones, or carved bits of antler. Not always large enough to invoke the gods, just enough to say, "We see you sea. We're not here to steal. It's the equivalent of knocking on the door before entering a storm. Back on the boat, Ketil lifts the net a little and peers into the water. Nothing yet. He reaches for a small, flat stone nestled beside the mast. You recognize it? It's the same type of runestone you saw earlier in his lunch sack, but this one's been worn smooth by salt and touch. He sets it gently on the bow and whistles. Just once. A sharp, clear note. Why, you ask? Cod don't like surprises, he says. This might sound ridiculous. But then again, you're sharing a boat with a man who carries 3 runes just to eat pickled eel without spiritual interference. You learn quickly that the fish themselves were not entirely fish in Norse thinking. They were omens, messengers, sometimes punishers. One quirky tidbit, a coastal tale from northern Norway, describes the troll torsk, a troll cod with moss on its back and human eyes. If caught, it would whisper your future before vanishing in a puff of steam. Fishermen were told to release it immediately or risk 7 years of back luck and the slow souring of all their barreled fish. Ketil has his own theory. You see a fish with one eye too many, he says you kiss your runestone. Then you throw back the fish. And maybe an apple. The sea likes apples. You raise an eyebrow. The sea eats apples. He nods entirely serious, and sometimes spits them back with bite marks. Historians still debate the depth of these beliefs. Were the fishermen truly convinced that fish could curse their families and salt their fields? Or were these stories more like warning tales, a cultural buffer against arrogance? Hard to say. But the fact remains, rune-charged food and carved charms were common companions on the sea. Some boats even had naming ceremonies before their maiden voyages, not unlike weddings. The boats were kissed with ale, blessed with herbs, and given a charm stone under the floorboards, sometimes the same stone that had once sat in a fisherman's lunch pouch, passed down seasoned with thyme and oil and eel grease. As the net tightens, Ketil grins. Something's down there. You peer over the side. Glimmering scales twist just beneath the surface. With a grunt, he hauls in the net, and sure enough, it's full. Herring. Cod. A lone, wriggling flounder. They slap against the bottom of the boat, spattering your boots with brine. He pats the stone on the bow. Told you, cod hate being doubted. You laugh, but you also take a small stone from your belt pouch, yours unmarked, and press it against the wood, just in case. Another fisherman rows past his beard like a snowdrift, a small talisman tied to his oar lock. He nods once, mutters a greeting, and continues without a word. You realize something. There's a quiet code here, not spoken, not formal, a kind of unspoken agreement between men and sea. You pack your food, you pack your charm, you whisper your rune, and you hope. You sit again, the net at your feet, wriggling with life. The sun is high now, the wind mild. You bite into a dried apple from your sack, half wondering if you should throw a slice overboard for good measure. Just as you do, a wave slaps the side of the boat. Coincidence? Maybe. Or maybe the sea just said thank you. The boat drifts gently as you and Ketil finish sorting the morning's catch. The cod go in one crate, the herring in another, and the single rebellious flounder is wrapped in a length of damp kelp like it asked for a nap. As the sun reaches its zenith and the fishing slows, Catil unfastens a small bundle from beneath the gunwale, a pouch made of seal hide stitched tightly with sinew. It's the kind of pouch that doesn't hold food. This one is for sacred things. He unties it slowly, revealing not just a rune stone, but a curious little collection. A whalebone comb, a folded piece of linen inked with smudged symbols, and a shriveled clove of garlic wrapped in dried bladder-wrack. You raise your eyebrows. Catil just shrugs. Everyone's got their pouch. You peer around the boat. Sure enough, there's another tucked behind the mast, slightly larger, this one bound in wool and copper thread, with faint stains that look suspiciously like blood. There's something deeply personal about it all, like these bundles are part toolkit, part diary, part spell book. And every fisherman has their own flavor. You lean against the side and chew thoughtfully on a biscuit, watching as Catil opens a third pouch, smaller than the others. This one holds a single charred twig etched with the rune Thurisaz, a protective rune often linked to Thor and brute strength, and a brittle feather maybe from a raven, maybe from a seagull, with aspirations. A real historical fact. Archaeologists excavating Norse settlements in Greenland and northern Norway have found dozens of small personal pouches, many filled with organic materials that weren't obviously useful feathers, bone slivers, odd-shaped stones. Some were interpreted as medicine, others magic, especially when paired with fragments of carved runes or symbolic knots. You wonder, were these charms for luck, for health, for making sure the herring didn't swim away with the oars? The answer is yes, all of the above. Pouches were a kind of personal spell kit, and much like a well-seasoned cast iron pan, they took on the character of their owner. Fishermen often stitched them themselves, or inherited them from uncles and brothers. Each new voyage meant adding a piece, a new rune, a lucky button, a scale from an oddly colored fish caught at twilight. A quirky tidbit one sagaman wrote of a man named Bjarni, who stitched a lunch pouch so stuffed with charms it squeaked when he sat down. His shipmates joked that he could fend off a sea serpent with nothing but a firm pat on his satchel. When the ship did survive a surprise storm, they stopped laughing. Catil finishes inspecting his pouches and replaces them carefully, his hands moving with the delicacy of a ritual. He even taps each one 3 times, an old habit, maybe, or an unwritten rule. You decide not to ask. Instead, you glance into your own satchel, where your simple rune stone nestles beside the last of your dried fish. You reach into your own pocket and find a small, flat pebble. You hadn't even realized you brought it. No runes, no signs, just a comfort stone. Smooth, cool, familiar. Maybe that's all a charm needs to be. Historians still debate the categorization of these pouches. Were they sacred personal cultural performance? The lines blur. Some argue they were folk religion in action, practical paganism. Others say they were simply emotional anchors, objects used to hold fear at bay in the vast and indifferent expanse of sea. You lean forward now, watching Ketil open yet another pouch, this one embroidered with red thread. Inside, a tiny wooden horse, barely the size of your thumb, carved with 2 runes, Ehwaz, motion trust, travel, and Manaz, the self-community. He turns it in his fingers like an old coin. Made this when I was 10, he says. Took it on every boat since. You smile. It's a reminder that runes weren't just about doom and thunder and Thor's mighty backside. They were about continuity, the small, ordinary thread that stitched past to present. You think back to that sack from earlier, the one with the sea lavender bundle. It too was a pouch, just a more delicious one. Even the food has memory. One pouch you saw earlier had a clove of smoked garlic pressed into a folded cloth rune, likely meant to ward off both spirits and scurvy. Another man had a dried fish tail and a black stone with 3 notches. No one explained it. No one asked. Because on these boats, pouches were private, but not secret. Sacred, but practical. You'd never steal from another man's pouch, not even if he owed you ale and 3 weeks' worth of cod. That pouch held more than tools. It held trust. You glance back at the shore, still a thin line on the horizon, but it feels further now. The boat creaks again as the wind picks up. Ketil pulls his cloak tighter and taps one pouch absently. The raven feather flutters. You look down at your own stone, and without quite knowing why, tuck it into the inner fold of your tunic close to your chest. Not because it's magic necessarily, but because out here you don't gamble without something in your pouch. And everyone, it turns out, has something worth holding on to. The afternoon drifts on lazy and long, the sea lapping at the sides of the boat, like it's humming a song only cod can understand. Ketil squints into the distance and pulls out a stub of driftwood from his tool satchel. Not food, not charm, just a smooth, salt-bleached scrap with an itch to become something. And without a word, he starts carving. You lean over, curious. He's using a small iron blade worn to a nub at the handle, whittling the wood into a rough shape, flat on one side, curved on the other. Not art. Not yet. But something deliberate. And as his blade scratches across the surface, you start to see it, the faint outline of a rune. Of course, because apparently even mid-squall Norsemen found time to do a bit of rune work. It wasn't uncommon. In fact, carved runes on driftwood net floats, and even oars have been found across northern Europe, some etched with protection sigils, others with practical blessings, like, "May this not break," or more helpfully, "bring fish." You glance around the boat and realize Ketil isn't the only carver in the story. The rudder bears faint marks, probably once sharper, now worn smooth by weather and years. The runes are subtle, but they're there. You run your fingers over them, Tiwaz Raido, and what might be Berkano growth rebirth. Did you carve those, you ask? Ketil shakes his head. My father, and his brother before him. So these aren't just protective scribbles. They're ancestral graffiti. The kind of legacy that gets handed down not through legal documents, but through blade and splinter. One real historical fact among the many surviving Norse rune carvings, a surprising number were found on portable sea-worn surfaces, whalebone plaques, broken barrel staves, and yes, driftwood. Some were marked with prayers. Others simply bore names, as if the wood needed to know who it served. And that's the curious part. Because carving a rune wasn't passive. It was an act of activation. The moment the rune met the wood, it wasn't just a symbol. It was a living thing, part message, part spell, part stubborn scream into the void. You watch Catil now still carving. The wind picks up again. Not violent, just insistent. Enough to rock the boat in a way that makes your bones rethink lunch. The wood creaks. The water claps against the sides, and Catil's blade pauses. He flips the driftwood over and starts a second rune. This one's Laguz for waterflow the unconscious. A watery rune fitting for a day where the sky keeps forgetting how to behave. Do you always carve mid-float, you ask? He grins. Only when the sea needs reminding. You smile, but there's something steady in his hands, something ritualistic. And you begin to understand this isn't killing time. This is shaping time, making it obedient, making it meaningful. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some Norse rune carvers believed that if you carved a rune while in motion, especially while drifting, the rune would trap the energy of the moment. A stormy carving could carry lightning. A calm one. Safe passage. Which is probably why Catil's been muttering quietly for the last 2 minutes. He's tuning the spell. Historians still debate whether these carvings were high magic folk tradition or just something to keep idle hands from stabbing each other. Some even suggest they were proto-poetry expressions of emotion disguised as woodcraft, a rune for longing, for regret, for homesickness disguised as steady winds. You reach for your own knife, just for balance, of course, and examine a nearby bit of spare oar handle. It's nothing special, but in your hands, it feels like a blank page. You scratch a small mark, a looping ansuz for breath-speech connection. Not because you expect anything to happen, but because the act of carving makes the silence feel less hollow. Across the boat, Catil finishes. He dips the driftwood in seawater, watches the salt darken the carved lines, then tucks it under the rope coils at his feet. What now, you ask? He shrugs. Now the sea knows we're listening. And you do, in fact, listen. To the gulls overhead, still griping like it's their job. To the creak of sailcloth straining gently with each shift in wind. To the odd lapping rhythm of waves slapping wood like applause for a performance neither of you can see. Then, without warning, the boat lurches. Just a little. Just enough to make you grab the gunwale and Catil look up sharply. He peers into the water, mutters something that sounds like, "Not now," and reaches for one of his pouches. From it, he pulls a scrap of cloth, a rune rag barely the size of your palm. On it, I was again etched in red thread with 2 smaller runes flanking it. Isa, ice, stillness, and Kanaz vision knowledge. He holds it up, lets the wind tug at it, then ties it to the mast. Not high, not grand, just quietly present. You ask what it means. Calm the keel, he says. Sharp eyes. And don't panic. Fair enough. He nods at your carved oar piece. Keep it. Might be the only thing that listens when the sea's shouting. You stow the oar shard in your pocket. Not because it's perfect, but because it's yours now. And something about carving your own rune, however simple, makes the sea feel a little less enormous, a little more known. And on days like this, known is all you really need. The wind settles, not completely, but enough for the sail to slacken and the water to return to its rhythmic, lapping hush. You sit with your back against the gunwale, the carved oar scrap warm in your pocket. Across from you, Catil unties a small linen bundle. Not lunch, not a charm pouch this time, but something even older in spirit. A folded scrap of oil-soaked leather, creased and patched from decades of travel. He opens it slowly, reverently, revealing a series of rune marks inked in looping near calligraphic strokes. Not carved this time. Written, not shouted into stone, but whispered onto skin. You recognize some of the runes Gebo Algis Raidho, but in the center is something longer. A full spell, perhaps, a prayer. This Catil says is a fish blessing. You blink, you bless the fish. He grins. Not for their sake, for ours. And so begins your gentle tumble into one of the quietest, strangest, and most beautifully mundane of Viking practices, runes for blessing fish. A real historical fact. Several rune staves and scripts found in Norway, Iceland, and the Faroe Islands are believed to have been blessing spells for tools, nets, and catches invocations to Freyr Njord, or even local land spirits, to make the nets heavy and the bellies full. Some are full sentences. Others, just a symbol scratched into a net weight. You look closer at the leather scrap. The ink has faded in places, but the words are careful, clean. You ask where it came from. My grandmother Catil says, smoothing a crease. She wrote it for my father. Said if he ever pulled up 3 eels with no eyes, he'd know when to use it. You pause. Has that ever happened? He shrugs. Not yet. But I've had some close eels. You decide not to press the matter. Instead, you lean back and think about the idea of blessing fish, not in the modern menu sense, but in the spiritual one, offering gratitude before consumption and insurance against bad luck. Some fishermen even sang to their catch, a mix of apology and persuasion. Come to the net, they'd croon, and we will thank you well. It worked. Sometimes. A quirky tidbit in one saga, a fisherman claims to have caught a sea spirit disguised as a haddock. It offered him 3 pieces of advice, one of which was always thank your meal even if it bites. He later named his boat Haddock's Grace and swore he never lost another net. You peek inside your own pack. There's still some dried trout packed in vinegar and mint. You unfold a cloth around it and notice, surprise, a faint rune drawn in wine. Fehu, the rune of wealth and provision. Your lunch had a fish blessing baked right in. Historians still debate how widespread this practice really was. Some believe that rune-blessing food was a luxury of priestly or elite households. Others argue it was folk magic passed from parent to child, like bread recipes and bad jokes. But whether rare or widespread, one thing is clear to the Norse: words mattered, especially when written, especially when eaten. You remember a story Catil told earlier that fish respond to intention, that if you take more than you need, they know. that if you don't thank the sea, she'll send you home with a hole in your boat and a song in your ears that makes no sense until you're drowning. Not ominous at all. Ketil finishes refolding the leather scrap and kisses it once before tucking it into a bone tube strapped to his belt. He nods at your fish. "Thank it," he says. You stare at your half-eaten trout, then clear your throat. "Thank you, noble fish, for not being cursed." Ketil stares, then grins. "Not bad. Bit formal. But it'll do." You eat the rest in silence. The wind starts to shift again this time, steady and low. A good wind. A respectful wind. Across the boat, Ketil lights a small stub of beeswax and drips 3 dots of wax into the hollow of a wooden net weight, whispering words you don't recognize. He presses a rune stamp into the wax, a little cube of bone with Jera carved on one face. "Cycle," he says. "The sea gives, we take. We give, it remembers." You ask if the fish blessing works. Ketil shrugs. "Most days I come home. That's blessing enough." You glance overboard and think you see a flicker, just a flash of silver scales too bright to be natural. Or maybe it's just the sun playing tricks. Either way, you reach into your bag and without thinking, tear off a small piece of your bread. You toss it gently into the water. It floats, then sinks, and the waves swallow it like a quiet promise. You wonder how many fishermen made that same offering hundreds of years ago, some with full nets, some with empty stomachs, all with the same whisper in their heads, "Bless this fish. Bless this sea. Bless this small, strange life of mine." And for just a moment, the ocean feels very old and very kind. You stretch your legs out across the boat's bench as the sun starts to drift westward, fat and low, casting long golden streaks across the waves. The net rests coiled and content. The fish slosh in their crates, resigned to their fate. Ketil, meanwhile, is rummaging in the back of the boat, not for food or netting this time, but for something suspiciously solid and suspiciously sharp. He pulls out a miniature axe. Not full-sized, not even half-sized. This thing is barely as long as your hand, but the iron is real, the edge clean, the handle carved with swirls that look more decorative than deadly. You blink. You bring that fishing Ketil grins. It's not for fish, and thus begins the strange tale of why some Norsemen, especially the more superstitious or dramatically inclined, carried tiny weapons in their lunch sacks. Not for chopping wood, not for gutting cod, but for warding off spirits. This might sound like overkill, but then again, if your worldview includes sea trolls, wind wraiths, jealous draugr, and fish that whisper threats, you'd pack more than just salted cheese. One real historical fact: multiple Viking burials have included miniature tools and weapons, especially in coastal regions. These weren't toys. They were ritual objects, thought to hold symbolic or spiritual power extensions of the real item without the burden of iron weight. Some scholars think they were stand-ins for protection, small enough to carry, but strong enough to remind nearby spirits that the owner was not defenseless. And where better to tuck them than in your lunch, Ketil sets the little axe down beside a worn pouch. Inside the pouch are other oddities: a bone chip carved with runes, a bead made of amber, and something that might be shark teeth sewn into wool. You point. That's not standard fishing gear. No, he says. That's a warning. To the fish. To what eats fish. Ah. You glance over the side of the boat, half expecting to see a shimmering fin or a sea dragon tail. Thankfully, it's just water. But you're starting to understand. These men didn't just battle weather and waves. They lived in a world full of unseen threats, and they prepared the way you might for a camping trip with Bear's food fire weapon, and a carved rune promising you mean business. Here's a quirky tidbit: in some regions of northern Scandinavia, fishermen would carve teeth runes into wood and carry them alongside tools or charms. These runes mimicked the shape of a predator's bite and were believed to scare off malicious sea entities. One rune stick from western Norway literally reads, "Let nothing bite me today, not wave, not beast, not fate." It was believed that spirits respected confidence, and nothing says confidence like a teeny battle axe nestled next to your pickled eel pouch. Ketil picks up the bone chip next. It's etched with a spiral, and the rune Eichwaz, a symbol of connection between worlds, life and death, land and sea. The spiral is hypnotic, etched so finely it seems to shimmer. He ties it onto a small strip of leather and fastens it around his wrist. "Found this after the worst storm of my life," he says. "Carved it before I stopped shaking." You nod. "Does it work?" "I'm here," he says simply. That's not an answer, but it's enough. You think back to your own lunch earlier. That little strip of cloth with the faded rune. It's still in your bag, probably stained now with fish grease and oat crumbs. But you feel for it anyway, just to check. Still there. Historians still debate the purpose of these weapon charms. Were they active defenses like garlic against vampires, or symbolic gestures like waving a flag at a storm? Some even propose that these miniature weapons were oaths made physical, a promise to the gods or oneself to be brave in the face of dread. And fear was common at sea. You didn't always show it, but you packed for it. Some pouches even held small bits of silver, not currency, but warding metal. In Norse belief, silver was pure and bright, a known deterrent against malevolent spirits, especially those who lingered near water's edge. Add a rune for sharpness or defense, and you had a pocket full of no thank you. You ask Ketil how many charms he's carried in his life. Too many, he says. Lost a few, gave some away, buried one. You raise an eyebrow. He shrugs. Long story. Wrong fjord. You don't press. Some stories are meant to stay folded in the pouch. The boat sways again gently now. A breeze picks up. You reach into your own satchel, and inspired by Ketil's arsenal, pull out your carved ore shard. You scratch a new line into it, nothing elaborate. Just Tiwaz, the rune of courage. Not because you're scared, not exactly, but because it feels right. You place it beside your fish knife. A modest little duo. A blade for slicing, a rune for strength. That's your weapon set. Ketil watches with approval. Good choice, he says. Tiwaz bites back. You sit in silence after that. Just two fishermen surrounded by fish sails, creaking lunch sacks packed with a bizarre but oddly comforting mix of food and defensive symbolism. And you start to think, maybe all you really need to face the unknown is some pickled eel, a thumb-sized axe, and a symbol that says, "I see what's out there." And I'm not impressed. The sea mists creep in low and slow as afternoon settles into the soft shoulders of evening. You squint toward the horizon, where the line between sky and water begins to blur like wet ink. Everything takes on that pearly, dreamlike hue, fog-draped, wind-slicked whisper quiet. Ketil, of course, doesn't seem remotely concerned. He calmly reaches beneath the floorboard, lifts a flap of tanned sealskin, and pulls out what looks like a soggy, fish-smelling cloak bundled in twine and birch bark. You sniff. You regret it instantly. What is that? He grins, untying the bundle with all the pride of a man unveiling a sacred relic. This, he says, is the cod slick cloak. Oh dear. Because yes, there's always one more oddity in the Norse seafaring toolkit, that unique intersection of magic weatherproofing and possibly fermented herring grease. You watch as Ketil unfurls the cloak, more of a mantle, really. It's stitched from layers of wool lined with something slick and dark that glistens oddly in the low light. And tucked into one inner seam, you catch the unmistakable glint of a rune stone sewn into place like a button that got bored and developed spiritual opinions. One real historical fact, Norse fishermen commonly waterproofed their clothing with fish oil, animal fats, and even fermented whale blubber. These garments, while deeply unpleasant by modern standards, were surprisingly effective at repelling water, and in some cases layered with amulets or runes, sewn into the seams for spiritual protection. Ketil's cloak, a full ritual armor. Wore this during the net storm of '03, he says, slipping it on. We lost half the gear. Cloak stayed dry. Saved my backside. You nod, trying to breathe through your mouth. He pulls the hood up, pats a rune sewn into the shoulder seam, Isa for stillness and ice, and mutters something like, "Hold the line, hold the line." Is that a spell, you ask? More of a weather warning for whoever's listening. And according to Ketil, that includes the cloak. You glance around the boat and realize you've seen hints of this cod-slick tradition before small stones wrapped in seaweed tied into coat hems. Anchors inked with Perthro, the rune of fate. One man in a neighboring boat was wearing gloves stitched with dried fish skin, shiny silver, and disturbingly stylish. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some cloaks were deliberately soaked in fish brine and dried under moonlight, especially during the waxing phase. The logic: brine to honor the sea, moonlight to charge the protective runes sewn into the threads. Cloaks like that weren't washed ever. They were passed down stored with dried lavender or yarrow to mask the scent, and only worn in truly questionable weather. Ketil gestures for you to check the inside hem of the cloak. You run your fingers along it and feel something rough, tiny charms. A fragment of seal tooth, a chicken bone, a scale from an eel, and sewn in tight between stitches, a rune tag marked Othala Inheritance, Ancestral Protection Home. Cloaks like this, he says, aren't made. They're grown. You stare. Grown from storms, from failure, from luck, he replies. and a bit of fish glue. You're not sure whether he's joking. You're also not sure you care. Because as ridiculous as the cod-slick cloak appears reeking of old fish and desperation, it's undeniably impressive. A stitched-together shield made of superstition stubbornness and spiritual weather insurance. Historians still debate how literal these practices were. Some believe they were more symbolic than magical displays of seafaring identity rather than functional charms. Others argue the runes and fish bits served both psychological and spiritual purposes. You wear the cloak, you believe you're protected, and maybe that belief keeps your hand steadier in the storm. You nod slowly as Kettle wraps himself in his aromatic armor, then offers you a smaller fish-lined mantle, clearly the guest version. You hesitate. It's moist. But as you slip it over your shoulders, you feel a strange weight, not physical, but ritual. There's a rune tag sewn near your neck. El has protection, higher, self reaching skyward like antlers in a gale. It fits, uneasily, comfortingly, like borrowing someone else's dream. Ketil pulls the sail tighter. The fog thickens. Everything smells like salt and rain, and just a hint of sea spirit warning. He points at the horizon. Storm's there, but we've got time. You nod. Wrapped in layers of wool fish oil and whispered runes, you feel prepared. You reach into your bag, find your own rune shard, and slip it into the cloak's inner pocket, just to let the fabric know who you are. And as the boat drifts on into the gathering mist, you begin to understand what the cloak really means. It's not just weather gear, it's a declaration I will come back, even if I smell like a cod barrel doing it. You lean into the cloak, warm, damp, and lightly marinated, letting it settle over your shoulders like a mossy blanket. The world has gone soft and slow. Mist curls like wool around the boat. The water so rowdy hours ago now glides like glass. Everything hushes. Even the gulls fall silent. And in this stillness, Ketil does something peculiar. He yawns, stretches, then curls into the curve of the hull like a cat who's done all he needs to do today. Are you taking a nap? You whisper. He grunts. Storm's not here yet. Might as well get dream ready. You blink. You've heard of storm prep, but dream prep. Welcome to the unexpectedly cozy, completely real tradition of midday sea naps and the runes that guarded them. Because out here, drifting in the liminal space between horizon and home, Norse fishermen didn't just fight the waves. They slept with them. And they slept armed with spells. You settle in beside Ketil, watching him untie a small cloth bundle. Inside, not food, not tools, just a smooth river stone painted with a sleep rune worn down from years of handling. You recognize Kanaz for clarity, Laguz for dreams, and a faint outline of Sowilo sunlight, success, protection. A real historical fact. There's evidence from Norse folk tradition preserved in Icelandic grimoires and oral lore that certain runes were used to induce specific types of dreams. Dreaming wasn't idle. It was a form of listening, a way to tune in to God's fate omens. and occasionally your own better judgment. Ketil places the runestone under his hand, wrapped in the corner of his cloak. He mumbles something that sounds suspiciously like a lullaby, with suspiciously aggressive rhyme structure. You shift, wondering if you should nap too. The sea rocks the boat gently like a cradle made of wet wood and half-forgotten ancestors. Then Ketil starts snoring. Not loudly, not obnoxiously, just rhythmically, like a ritual of its own. You dig into your pouch and find a crumble of dried lichen wrapped in linen. You'd forgotten it was there, gifted to you back at the docks. Supposedly good for peaceful rest and belly calm. You inhale its faint, earthy scent and tuck it near your collarbone, just in case. A quirky tidbit, some Norse nap kits included small dream tokens, stones or bones carved with runes and slipped into a cap or hood. The belief that dreams entered through the crown of the head, and the token either welcomed or filtered them. It wasn't uncommon for fishers to wake, grab their dream token, and spit 3 times into the sea if the vision was bad. Because even the most peaceful nap could be a two-way mirror. You lie back now, head resting on a coiled net. The rune stone in your pocket pulses with imaginary weight. The sea for now behaves, and somewhere between one blink and the next, you slip into that soft, salty dream space fishermen have known for generations. Your dream is simple. A cod swims up from the deep, its eyes ancient and wise. It opens its mouth and speaks in runes, glowing letters that float like fireflies. You don't understand them, but you feel them, a message not for your ears, but for your bones. Then the fish bows, yes, bows, and disappears into the gloom. You wake to find Ketil already up sipping ale from a flask and watching you with one eyebrow raised. Good nap. You nod. Weird dream. He hands you a crust of bread. That's the sea saying hello, or warning you, or asking for sugar. Hard to tell. Historians still debate whether these nap runes were tied to Norse shamanic practices related to Seder, the dream walks, and spirit travel sometimes performed by Volar. Some sagas speak of sailors waking from midday naps and changing course based on what they saw. Was it intuition or divine suggestion, whispered through salted sleep? Ketil opens a small box beneath the bench. Inside are several rune-inscribed bone chips, worn smooth as dice. He shakes them once, then scatters them across the plank like crumbs. You see patterns. 2 Ehwaz runes movement travel, a Dagaz breakthrough, and 1 slightly cracked Nauthiz resistance friction need. He hums thoughtfully. Good wind coming, but it'll argue first. You don't ask how he knows. The sea nap told him. Or the runes. Or both. Because that's the thing about life on the water. You learn to listen to everything. Dreams. Runes. Cracks in the bread. Whispers from cod. The weight of the cloak. The way mist curls around your ankles like a question you forgot to answer. You look out over the water now, smooth, soft, reflective. For a moment, it doesn't feel like you're in a boat. It feels like you're drifting through a story. A story told not with words, but with carved lines on stone bone bread and dreams. And at the center of that story, a nap. A charm. and the sacred belief that sometimes sleep is the bravest thing you can do. The wind is back, not wild, but definite. It rustles the sail and nudges the boat forward with the slow insistence of an elder who's decided it's time you got home. Ketil ties off a line, checks a fish crate, and retrieves a scrap of parchment tucked inside his vest. He holds it carefully as if it might flap away with a secret. "What's that, you ask?" He smirks. "A note. From who? From her." He doesn't say more, just pats his chest, tucked next to the runestone. Safer there than in a poem. You lean closer. The parchment is worn soft-creased from folding and unfolding. The ink's faded, but legible. And along the margin, runes, carefully drawn. A few with dots, loops, and little artistic flourishes. One even looks like a fish with hearts for fins. You blink. That's a love note. Ketil grins. Why not? And now at last we sail into one of the softest, strangest parts of Norse fishing culture, the romantic runes. Because yes, buried among the fish prayers, eel pouches, and bone charms, there were those who used runes for flirting, sometimes openly, sometimes in deeply coded whispers, and sometimes they packed them in their lunch sacks. A real historical fact, in places like Bergen, dozens of runic love messages have been found scrawled on wood or bone, little notes, some cheeky, some sincere. One famous fragment reads, "I love you, Gunhild, beyond ale and salted lamb," which for a Norseman is serious business. You picture it now, a young fisherman sneaking a rune staff into his dried salmon bundle, hoping the girl at the net-weaving station will find it and laugh or blush. Or best-case scenario, right back with her own rune on a turnip peel. Ketil gently tucks the note away, like it's part of his rib cage. She tied it around a berry cake, he says. "Before my first sail, said I'd better not feed it to the gulls. Did you eat the cake?" He shrugs. "I wasn't going to. But then a gull got it anyway. Pretty sure the note scared it off, though." The romantic runes weren't always poetic. Some were more suggestive, we'll call them fjord flirtations. Runes carved on fish bones, packed in lunch, sent across the water on the chance someone would find them. It's like a Norse version of a message in a bottle, except it might say, "Your braid is finer than sea silk," or "nice nets." A quirky tidbit, a few recovered rune sticks include love spells disguised as fishing chants. One rune poem reads like a storm prayer until you realize each line begins with the name of a different lover, and the last line says, "Only one brings calm to my boat." Historians still debate how often these were real expressions versus playful jabs among shipmates. In male-dominated crews, it was common to tease each other with mock love charms. One fisherman might slip a rune-inlaid fish scale into another's sack, only to claim later it came from a mermaid who fancied him. Ketil pulls out another item, a woven ribbon dyed a dusty blue, barely holding its shape. Sewn into the edge is a single rune, Wunjo, for joy, comfort, affection. He doesn't say who it's from, just presses it against the base of his neck for a moment, then ties it around the grip of his knife. "Good luck," he says softly. You feel around in your own pouch, wondering if anything qualifies as romantic. The dried plum wrapped in birch bark. Maybe. You unfold it, and yes, there it is. A little carved heart done in charcoal. No runes, just a symbol. It wasn't yours. You don't remember packing it. But someone did. You tuck it gently into the lining of your sack beside your own runestone. Because there's something undeniably beautiful about the idea of sailing with someone's blessing stitched into your bread. Of protection that isn't just divine, but emotional, personal. The fish don't care about your crush, but maybe the sea does. And so out here among the fog and salt, a love note becomes a talisman. A rune-scribbled ribbon turns into a ward against loneliness. A scribbled pun on an eel skin strip becomes the best joke you'll read all week. And sometimes it's just a way to say, "Come home to me." You glance at Ketil. His hand rests on the lunch pouch like it holds more than food, more than fortune. It holds the words of someone who remembered him, and remembered to wrap that message in string ink and just the right rune. You close your eyes for a moment and imagine hands tracing lines, carving slowly, hoping the boat wouldn't capsize before the charm was read. Romance in this world isn't about roses or oaths. It's about wrapping magic into your midday meal, trusting that love, like fish, knows how to find its way home. The sea darkens, not with storm, at least not yet, but with the heavy shadow of evening. The mist has thinned into tendrils, leaving the sky wide and the air damp with silence. You sit back, bellies full cloaks, fish slick and snug, and for a moment, everything feels calm. Until Ketil drops a clay jar. It hits the planks with a thud and a dull crack. Both of you freeze. He slowly lifts the jar. A pale line splits its side. A sliver falls away like a fingernail, revealing the faint sheen of pickled herring within. Ketil mutters something very old and very unprintable, because broken herring jars, they're more than just messy, they're omens. You've just stumbled into the bizarre, slippery world of accidental rune curses and the perils of fishpot misfortune. Ketil peers into the cracked jar, and without hesitation tips a spoonful into the sea. A libation, a peace offering, a bribe, maybe. Then he produces a small bundle of cloth, unrolls it to reveal 3 rune chips, worn, nicked, slightly greasy. And yes, each one has a different rune. You've got a system for herring jars, you ask. He doesn't answer. He just picks the rune with Perthro, the rune of fate and uncertainty, and drops it gently into the jar. That's the one you use when you've made a mistake. A real historical fact. Norse rune magic included not just active spells, but counterspells, charms to reverse bad luck, neutralize curses, or even delay fate. Some were verbal. Others were ritual objects dropped into water, buried in mud, or tied to the person in need of redemption. In this case, herring juice and resignation. Ketil replaces the cloth bundle in his coat, now slightly more anxious. "You don't mess with food vessels," he says, "especially after dark. Because of spirits, because of echoes. Things you've said near your food come back louder." Oh, that's comforting. You peer into your own pack, quietly relieved that your bread hasn't exploded or burst into flame. But you do notice a faint crack in your vinegar jar lid, You whisper a silent apology to it, just in case. Here's a quirky tidbit. In one coastal saga, a fisherman claimed his barrel of sour beer exploded after he mocked a neighbor's lunch charm. The barrel wasn't cursed, but the words had been careless. The neighbor's reply, "The fish heard you." Which begs the question, are the fish listening? Catil seems to think so. He dips a piece of driftwood into the leaking herring jar, then carves a small spiral on it. No rune, just motion. He lets it dry for a moment before tucking it behind the mast. "It'll hold the bad luck," he says, "so it can't climb back into the sack." You wonder how many accidental curses began this way. One cracked jar, one unspoken rule, one fisherman who forgot to tap his lunch pouch 3 times before opening it. Historians still debate whether these rituals were universal practice or simply regional superstitions. Some argue that food magic was widespread part of daily life, an unspoken rhythm of protection. Others believe it varied from fjord to fjord, shaped by local lore, grandmother warnings, and the occasionally cursed eel. You lean over and ask, "Have you ever seen a food curse come true?" Ketil doesn't answer right away. Then quietly, a man once ate from a cracked jar without knowing it. That night, the fog didn't move. We rowed until morning. The shore never got closer. He didn't bring runes. The rest of us did. What happened? He shrugs. He swore he saw someone swimming beside the boat, said she was speaking, but not in our tongue. You both fall quiet. Because even if it's just a tale, even if the fish spirits don't care about jars or runes, or you whispering apologies to your vinegar, there's still a sense that some things don't need to be tested twice. You remember the lunch pouches, soft cloth, oil-stained leather, little shrines cradling bone charms and bread crusts. They weren't packed carelessly, and now you know why. Even food containers held intention. Their silence was earned, their integrity crucial. The cracked herring jar has now been lashed with thin reed cord and set in the stern alone. Ketil places a small fish scale over its opening like a makeshift lid. A temporary rune, he says, for sealing what we can't undo. You nod, not because you fully understand, but because the fish might be listening. And if they are, you want them to know you've been very polite today. The light has gone silver, now reflected off the water in long ribbons that stretch toward dusk, like fingers of half-forgotten memory. The sea is calm deceptively, so the kind of stillness that always feels like it's holding its breath. You and Ketil both sit quiet, watching the horizon like it might blink. Then he stands, brushes crumbs off his tunic, and reaches into the bow. He pulls out something heavy, pale, bone, not the kind that belonged to a fish. Bigger, curved like a crescent moon. You recognize it almost immediately, whalebone. Broad, smooth, yellowed with age, and carved, of course, with runes. You lean forward. That's not from lunch. No, Ketil says. It's from the sky. You blink. The sky storms, dreams, and whale breath. It all mixes up after a while. And with that, you're pulled headfirst into the strange world of weather-reading runes carved onto whale bones and used by Norsemen to predict everything from sudden storms to whether lunch would spoil before the second bite. A real historical fact, bones, especially those of whales, seals, and large sea mammals, were often repurposed into ritual tools and divination surfaces in seafaring cultures. In the Norse world, particularly among those who lived far from temples, these tools became portable sanctuaries, part map, part compass, part magical bulletin board. Ketil lays the bone across his lap. It's etched with circles and spirals, not entirely unlike a lunar chart. Around the edges are clusters of runes, grouped in trios, each one burned black with soot or fish ink. He runs his finger over one cluster, Hagalaz Isa Thurisaz Hail Ice and Conflict. He frowns. That's storm weather, he mutters. 2 days out, cold, sharp. You peer closer. The bone is not just a forecast, it's a living narrative. Lines connect the rune clusters like pathways weaving potential from symbol to symbol. Some have been scraped away, others highlighted with crushed charcoal. Near the center is a smudged thumbprint. Ketil leaves it untouched. Mine, you ask? He shakes his head. My uncle's. That's the thing about these bones. They weren't just tools. They were kept tied to families' boats, even fishing routes. And they were used not just for reading the weather, but for reading the world. A quirky tidbit in one preserved saga fragment, a man named Styrmir used a carved walrus tusk to determine whether his wife's salted trout had gone off. He rolled a set of rune-marked bone chips across it, then claimed the reading said, "Your fish is rebellious. Cook it with more dill." She reportedly chased him with a skillet. Ketil grins as he turns the bone sideways. This side's for reading meals. And sure enough, the reverse is carved with food runes. Fehu Wealth Gibo, offering Wunjo Joy, and a tiny bind rune that blends Awaz with Raido, interpreted here as safe digestion on the move. I read it every morning, Ketil says. If Wunjo is faint, I pack less eel. You stare. He shrugs. Last time I ignored it, I was swimming home with indigestion and a broken oar. Historians still debate how literal these weather bones were. Some believe they served as mnemonic devices, reminders to sailors about patterns and seasonal shifts. Others argue they were sacred instruments for seers or rune readers used to track divine favor, magical risk, or the moods of the sea herself. The bone shifts slightly in Ketil's hand, and he points to a fresh etching done recently, the soot still smudgy. Carved that last week, he says. Dream said I'd meet someone with good bread and a strange question. You blink. You dreamt about me. He nods. Didn't say it was you. Could have been a goose. But the bread checks out. You laugh, unsure whether to be flattered or concerned. You lean back as he runs his hands over the whalebone one last time, then tucks it gently into a seal hide sleeve beneath the bench. Not wrapped like a weapon, but like something sacred, something that listens. You glance toward the sky now streaked with deep plum and orange. The water's reflection sways gently patterned like polished obsidian. It doesn't look stormy, but maybe that's the trick. Maybe the sea hides her moods until the last minute like a cat deciding whether to nap or claw your face. And maybe the runes on the bone don't predict. Maybe they warn. You reach into your pouch and find your own rune chip, the little carved ore fragment from earlier. You scratch a tiny dagaz into the corner. It's a day rune. A rune of transition, of sunrise or sunset. You don't know which. But either way, it feels like the right one for this moment. Because reading weather isn't about certainty. It's about being ready. And in a world where fish bones speak and storms sneak up from below, sometimes readiness is just another word for respect. Katil looks at the horizon, nods once, and smiles. Sky's thinking. Sea's quiet. Bones say tomorrow's fair. You exhale, then whisper mostly to yourself, so be it. The sea is lavender now, half light and hush. The fish in the crates murmur against each other in sleepy sloshes, and even the wind seems to take a break, draping itself over the boat like a blanket instead of a shove. Ketil reaches for the salted fish box. Not to eat from it, though he does eye it like he's debating it. Instead, he slides it toward the middle of the boat with the care of a man handling a sacred relic. You arch an eyebrow. "We summoning something?" He chuckles. Not summoning. Swearing. And that, dear listener, is how you find yourself in the most unexpected Norse custom of them all, the salt box oath. Because while most people think of runestones as something left in the ground, carved on monuments, or stuck in lunch sacks next to fish paste, there were also the portable altars, wooden boxes lined with dried salt and fish brine, where people made promises, sealed deals, and occasionally broke up with their future in-laws. Real historical fact. Norse society was highly legalistic, even in informal settings. Oaths were binding, spoken in front of witnesses, and often marked by physical tokens, drinking horns, weapons, or stones. But in coastal communities, especially among seafarers and traders, oaths were made in containers of salt and preserved fish, the everyday currency of survival. The box Katil sets before you isn't much to look at. Plain wood, salt-stained edges, a faint carving on the lid, Othala, the rune of inheritance and home. He opens it. Inside you see layers, a thin bed of dried salt crystals, several scales pressed flat like old leaves, and a folded scrap of linen stained with something that looks like berry juice, but is probably fish blood. On top sits a flat stone engraved with a single word, Halda, hold. It's not about big promises, Ketil says. Just reminders. Things you mean. Things you really mean. He hands you a flat stick of driftwood. Write yours. You stare. I wasn't planning on swearing any fish oaths today, you say. He grins. Nobody does. But the sea listens better when you've put something in the box. You take the wood and your bone knife. After a pause, you scratch a single word, return. It's simple. Honest. Enough. Ketil reads it, nods, then presses the stick into the salt beside his own forgive. You can swear anything you ask. He shrugs. Some people swear to love someone forever. Some swear to stop lying about where they hide the good pickled onions. He lifts another stick from the box. The rune's almost faded. Let go, it says. That one didn't work, he mutters. Then he lays it back anyway. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some oaths were personal and others collective. Crews would gather around the salt box before a voyage and swear not to steal from the net, not to take the last herring without offering a blessing, or not to speak ill of a shipmate unless they were really annoying. Some even used salt boxes to announce divorces, a rare but legal Norse tradition. A man or woman could declare the separation by stating it in front of witnesses, ideally 3, or in a pinch the salt box and a herring, because nothing says finality like passive-aggressive pickled symbolism. Historians still debate whether these containers were spiritual artifacts or just practical vessels made sacred through repetition. Some believe they doubled as offering boxes left in shrines or burned after especially intense voyages. Others think they simply helped people remember their words because when you whisper into a salted fish box, you really commit. You press your finger against your driftwood oath. The salt bites a little. It's oddly satisfying. Ketil pulls out a tiny clay cup, scoops a pinch of salt from the box, and tosses it over the side of the boat. To carry it, he says, so the sea knows. You do the same. Then sit back, blinking at the weird gravity of what just happened. You've sworn an oath. In a salted box. Over fish. And somehow it feels absolutely right. You glance at the runestone still tucked into your belt pouch. You trace its edge, wondering what promises it holds. Who first packed it? What they whispered to it between bites of dried trout and swigs of beer. Maybe they made an oath like yours. Maybe they didn't return. Or maybe they did, and that's why their rune found its way to you. The box is closed now, tied with a strip of eel skin that glints in the fading light. You and Ketil don't say anything, because salt has a way of sealing not just food, but meaning. And the sea, she remembers what's spoken into her brine. The horizon swells gently as you sail toward it, the sun now a faint red coin, sliding behind the low spine of distant cliffs. The sea glows. The nets are stowed. The fish rest. You and Ketil sit in the quiet comfort of a shared boat, surrounded by charms, salted bread crusts, and the thick, lingering scent of pickled everything. You'd think the magic would be done by now, but no. Ketil reaches under the bench and pulls out a flat, moss-lined basket, small enough to cradle in one hand. It's woven from birch bark sealed with beeswax and stitched in a pattern that by now you recognize a looping bind rune for memory favor and return. He opens it. Inside are stones, small ones, smooth, every shape imaginable, some carved, some unmarked, all nestled in moss like sleeping thoughts. These, he says, are the ones that stopped working. You blink. Stopped. He nods. Some runes go quiet. Some just fade. And now you enter the final, most mysterious realm of your Norse voyage, the silent runes. Because not every charm held forever. Not every rune sang its purpose across the water. Sometimes even the most carefully carved protections would go still, losing whatever spark they'd once held. A real historical fact. Some rune artifacts show signs of being ritually buried or submerged, placed in bogs' shorelines, or beneath doorposts, after apparent disuse. Scholars believe these were retired, not discarded, given rest after long service. It was considered dangerous, even disrespectful, to throw a rune stone away casually. Ketil holds up one smooth, dark stone. This one was my brother's. For catching herring. Worked for years. Then one day, he trails off. Empty, like a net with no tug. You watch as he places it gently back in the basket. You ask what he does with them. Nothing, he says. They've done their work. I just keep them near the boat. So they remember the sea, and the sea remembers them. Some of the stones bear wear marks, thumbprints, nicks from teeth, rubbed symbols so faded they've become whispers. You realize that runes aren't just tools, they're companions. And sometimes companions grow tired. A quirky tidbit in one old fisherman's tale from the Lofoten Islands. A man wore the same rune around his neck for 40 years. When he died, they tied the stone to the boat's prow and let the current carry it off. Weeks later, the boat returned empty intact. The rune's job, they said, was to bring the boat home. Not the man. You trace the edge of your own rune shard. It's still sharp, still humming, but you wonder, will it ever stop? And when it does, will you know? Ketil closes the basket. They're part of the crew even now. The sun is gone. The water turns black and gold, reflecting stars just beginning to shimmer. The boat glides slowly toward the shore. You can see the faint glow of torches on the dock. You're nearly back. You glance down at the rune stone you packed beside your bread, now warm from the day. The boat bumps gently against the dock ropes, creaking, as they're tied off oars resting like folded wings. The world is quiet now. Nothing left to haul, no charms left to unwrap. No eel to coax into a jar. Fog coils around the posts, curling in and out of the planks like a cat twining through your legs. Overhead, the stars spill across the sky, flickering pinpricks reflected in the water like runes from the gods themselves, scattered for you to read or dream or simply rest beneath. You and Ketil move slowly, deliberately. Each net is lifted, each stone placed, each charm pouch tucked back into its proper nook. Even the cod-slick cloak gets its due, a shake, a fold, a whisper of thanks. The sea laps at the dock with soft, endless patience. You walk home under the hush of pine trees, runestone tucked inside your coat, its carved lines worn familiar by the warmth of your hand. The mist breathes beside you, a quiet rhythm, a lullaby written in salt and smoke and old fish-scented magic. At your door, you pause. In your pocket, the rune still hums. Not loudly, just enough to remind you, you listened, you respected, you returned. And tomorrow, well, tomorrow the sea may ask again, but tonight, you're home, you're whole, and your lunch sack still smells slightly of sacred cod.